It was an unusually foggy evening when my friends and I decided to take a detour on our way home from a camping trip. We had heard rumors about the old Hastings mansion, a sprawling estate abandoned for decades on the outskirts of town. None of us were particularly superstitious, but the idea of exploring a reputedly haunted house was too intriguing to pass up. We arrived at the mansion as twilight descended. The once grand structure now stood as a crumbling relic, its tall, iron wrought gates hanging ajar. The fog seemed to cling to the estate, adding an extra layer of eeriness to the scene. We parked the car and approached the front steps, our flashlights cutting through the dense mist. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Sarah asked, her voice quivering slightly. "Come on, it'll be fun," Jake replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. We pushed open the heavy front door, which groaned on its hinges. The interior was shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from our flashlights. The grand foyer, with its dust-covered furniture and cracked wallpaper, looked like something out of a forgotten era. As we explored, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The mansion felt alive with creaks and groans, and the air was thick with dust. Every room seemed to hold the whispers of a forgotten past. We laughed nervously, trying to dismiss the growing unease. It wasn't until we reached the second floor that things started to get strange. The hallway was long and narrow, with doors leading off into darkened rooms. We entered one of the rooms, which was filled with old, decrepit furniture and a large, antique mirror. "Check this out," Jake said, motioning towards the mirror. We gathered around it, and I noticed that the glass was fogged up. I wiped a hand across it, revealing a clear reflection. But as we looked, something caught my eye behind us in the mirror. There was a shadowy figure standing just outside the frame. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the darkness, but unmistakable nonetheless. "Do you see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What?" Sarah asked, peering into the mirror. "There's someone behind us," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We all turned around, but the room was empty. My heart was pounding. I turned back to the mirror, and the figure was gone. We exchanged nervous glances, trying to rationalize what we had seen. "I'm sure it's nothing," Jake said, though his voice betrayed his unease. "Let's keep moving." We continued down the hallway, but the sense of foreboding only grew stronger. The air felt colder, and the fog outside seemed to have thickened. We decided to explore the attic, which was accessed by a narrow staircase at the end of the hall. The stairs creaked under our weight as we climbed. The attic was cluttered with old trunks, broken furniture, and dusty antiques. As we poked around, the temperature seemed to drop noticeably. Our breath became visible, and the silence was oppressive. Suddenly, we heard a loud thud from the far end of the attic. We froze, our flashlights scanning the darkness. It sounded like something heavy had been dropped or moved. We inched closer to the sound, but the source remained hidden. "Okay, this is getting creepy," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I agree," I said. "Let's head back downstairs." As we made our way back, the fog outside had thickened even more. Visibility was almost zero, and the mansion felt like it was closing in on us. The sense of unease was overwhelming, but we pressed on. We reached the front door, but it wouldn't budge. The door was stuck, and despite our best efforts, we couldn't force it open. Panic set in as we realized we were trapped inside. The fog outside seemed to press against the windows, as if trying to get in. "What do we do now?" Jake asked, his voice strained. "Let's try the windows," I suggested. We moved to the nearest window and managed to pry it open just enough to squeeze through. One by one, we climbed out into the dense fog. The cool night air was a welcome relief, and we quickly made our way back to the car. As we drove away, the mansion receded into the foggy distance. We were all shaken, but relieved to be out. We never spoke much about that night again, but the sense of something unseen, lurking just beyond our sight, stayed with us. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching us from within that old mansion. We survived the night, but the mystery of the Hastings mansion remains unsolved, a chilling reminder that some places are best left undisturbed. The moon was full, casting a ghostly light over the crumbling building. It stood isolated and silent, a hulking mass of decaying stone and rusted metal. The tall iron gates were ajar, and we slipped through, feeling a mix of excitement and unease. The building was enormous, with long corridors and high ceilings that seemed to stretch on forever. We entered through a broken side door, and the smell of damp and decay hit us immediately. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing old furniture covered in dust, peeling wallpaper, and the remnants of a forgotten past. As we wandered through the first floor, The atmosphere was tense but manageable. The sound of our footsteps echoed off the walls, and every now and then, a distant creak would make us jump. The deeper we went into the asylum, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air was colder, and an unsettling quiet seemed to hang over everything. After exploring the main areas, we decided to check out the basement. The stairs were narrow and steep, descending into darkness. We lit up our flashlights and began our descent, the temperature dropping noticeably with each step. The basement was a maze of old storage rooms and maintenance areas. We walked through rooms filled with rusted equipment and broken furniture. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional scurrying sound of rats or the drip of water from leaky pipes. As we rounded a corner, we found ourselves in a small, dimly lit room. It was different from the others. There was an old examination table in the center, surrounded by a scattering of medical instruments and yellowed paperwork. The room felt strangely colder, and the air had a faint metallic taste. "What is this place?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I think it might have been an old examination room," I replied, trying to sound calm. We were about to leave when we heard a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere deeper in the basement. It was soft at first, but it grew louder and more insistent. We froze, our flashlights darting around the room. "Did anyone else hear that?" Jake asked, his face pale. "Yeah, I heard it," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We decided to follow the sound. The tapping seemed to lead us further into the labyrinthine basement. The air grew colder, and the sound grew louder until it was almost deafening. We turned the corner and saw a small door slightly ajar. The tapping was coming from behind it. "I'm going to check it out," I said, though my heart was racing. I pushed the door open slowly. Beyond it was a small, dark room, and in the center was an old, rusty pipe that seemed to be vibrating, producing the rhythmic tapping sound. It was clear that the sound was coming from the pipe, not from anything supernatural. "Looks like it's just the pipe," I said, relieved. The vibration must be causing the noise. We examined the pipe for a moment, but the tapping continued intermittently. The basement felt oddly more oppressive now, and we decided it was time to leave. As we made our way back to the stairs, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The quiet was heavier, and the sense of being watched grew stronger. We hurried up the stairs and out of the asylum. The night air never felt so refreshing. Once we were back in the car, we took a moment to catch our breath and laugh off the tension. Despite our relief at having left the asylum, the experience had left us on edge. We never returned to the asylum, and over time, the memory of the rhythmic tapping and the cold, oppressive atmosphere became a shared story among us, one that reminded us that some places hold an unsettling presence, no matter how rational we try to be. It was a typical summer evening when my friends and I decided to visit an old, abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town. Rumor had it that the place was haunted, but none of us took the stories too seriously. We were looking for a bit of adventure, not believing for a second that anything truly terrifying would happen. The mansion was a decrepit Victorian relic, its once grand facade now covered in grime and ivy. We parked a few hundred yards away and approached the house, the air thick with the scent of overgrown vegetation. As we neared the front door, we noticed that it was slightly ajar, creaking in the breeze like an unwelcome invitation. "Should we really do this?" Emily asked, her voice wavering slightly. "Come on," Jake said, his bravado unshaken. "It'll be fun. Let's just check it out." We pushed the door open and stepped inside. The foyer was enormous, with a grand staircase that led to the upper floors. The air was musty, and a thick layer of dust covered every surface. We switched on our flashlights, their beams slicing through the darkness and revealing faded wallpaper and cobwebs. We wandered through the main rooms, noting the remnants of what had once been an opulent home. It was as if time had stopped in the mansion. Old portraits hung crookedly on the walls, and antique furniture lay draped in white sheets. Everything was eerily still. When we reached the basement door, curiosity got the better of us. It was a heavy, wooden door with a rusty handle. We exchanged uneasy glances but decided to explore it. The stairs down were steep and creaked under our weight. We descended into the cold, damp darkness. The basement was filled with broken furniture, old trunks, and dusty shelves. There was a strange, musty odor that made the air feel heavy. As we moved deeper, we noticed a large mirror standing against the far wall, partially obscured by stacks of old newspapers. "Check out this old mirror," Jake said, shining his flashlight on it. "It's like something out of a horror movie." I stepped closer to examine it. The mirror's frame was ornate but tarnished with age. As I wiped away some of the dust, I was struck by a sudden, unsettling feeling. The reflection was distorted, but there was something else, a faint, dark shape moving in the background. Guys, look at this, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Emily and Sarah approached, their flashlights casting strange shadows. They peered into the mirror, but the dark shape was gone. We shrugged it off as a trick of the light. Let's get out of here, Sarah suggested, her anxiety palpable. As we made our way back upstairs, we heard a soft thud from the upper floors. We froze, exchanging nervous glances. The sound was followed by what seemed like a low, mournful wail. The noise was so distant yet strangely close, resonating through the old walls. What was that? Emily whispered, her face pale. I don't know, I said, trying to sound confident despite my racing heart. Maybe it's just the house settling. We reached the main floor, but the wailing continued. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the attic. Against our better judgment, we decided to investigate. The attic door was hidden behind a large, dusty curtain. We pulled it aside and found the door, old and creaky, leading up to the attic. As we climbed the narrow stairs, the wailing grew louder and more insistent. The attic was a cluttered space, filled with old trunks, boxes, and furniture covered in white sheets. We scanned the room with our flashlights, but there was no sign of anyone or anything out of the ordinary. Okay, this is seriously creepy, Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. Let's just go, I suggested, my nerves on edge. As we made our way back downstairs, the wailing abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. We exited the mansion quickly, the sense of relief palpable as we stepped into the cool night air. We talked about the experience later, trying to make sense of the strange occurrences. The mirror's dark shape and the eerie wailing were unsettling, but we had all made it out safely. The mansion remained a mystery, a place that seemed to hold on to something beyond our understanding. Despite the fear we felt, the knowledge that we weren't harmed gave us a strange sense of closure. The old mansion would stay with us as a reminder that some places have an unsettling presence that defies easy explanation, and some mysteries are best left unsolved. It was a chilly, overcast evening when my friends and I decided to visit the old Sutton house, a dilapidated mansion on the edge of town. It had been vacant for decades and was the subject of countless ghost stories among the locals. None of us were particularly superstitious, but the idea of exploring a genuinely creepy place was too tempting to resist. We arrived just as twilight began to cloak the landscape in shadow. The mansion stood tall and imposing, its once grand facade now covered in ivy and decay. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking as the wind nudged it open. We hesitated, but the allure of the unknown pushed us forward. The interior was a jumble of rotting furniture and dust-covered relics. The air was heavy with mildew, and the silence was broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. We wandered through the rooms, each one more unsettling than the last. It felt like we were stepping back in time, but there was an oppressive atmosphere that made my skin crawl. We decided to check out the basement. The stairs, narrow and steep, descended into darkness. As we made our way down, the air grew colder, and the smell of dampness intensified. Our flashlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a large, cluttered space filled with old trunks, broken furniture, and dusty shelves. In the corner of the basement, partially hidden behind a stack of old newspapers, was a large mirror. Its ornate frame was tarnished, and the glass was streaked with grime. I wiped the patch clean and stared into the reflection. The basement looked almost exactly the same as it did in the mirror, except for one disturbing detail, a shadowy figure standing just out of sight. Guys, check this out, I called, my voice unsteady. They gathered around, and we all peered at the mirror. The figure was indistinct, a dark shape that seemed to shift and waver. It was positioned just outside the view of our flashlights, which made it difficult to discern any details. Is that a trick of the light? Emily asked, her voice trembling. I don't think so, Jake said, looking equally unnerved. Before we could react further, a loud bang echoed from upstairs, followed by what sounded like footsteps. We froze, our hearts pounding in our chests. The footsteps grew louder, moving closer to the basement stairs. Someone else must be here, Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. We exchanged glances, our bravado quickly dissolving into panic. We hurried up the stairs, but as we reached the main floor, the noise abruptly stopped. The house fell eerily silent, and the oppressive feeling returned. We searched the main floor but found no one. The house was still and empty. The footsteps and bangs had stopped, leaving us in an unsettling silence. We couldn't find any rational explanation for the sounds, and the mirror's shadowy figure remained unexplained. "Let's get out of here," I suggested, my voice shaking. "This place is creeping me out." We agreed and quickly made our way back to the front door. As we left the mansion, I glanced back at the house, a chill running down my spine. The once inviting facade now seemed menacing, as if it were hiding something sinister. Outside, the night air felt almost comforting after the oppressive atmosphere of the mansion. We got into the car and drove away, the unsettling events of the evening replaying in our minds. The next day, I tried to research the history of the Sutton house but found little information. The house had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, and there were no records of recent activity. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that something was watching us from within those walls. The shadowy figure in the mirror and the mysterious noises remain a mystery, a reminder that some places hold secrets that are best left undisturbed. The Sutton house is still there, a haunting presence on the edge of town, and while we all made it out safely, the experience left a lasting impression on all of us. It was a cool autumn evening when my friends and I decided to explore the old Miller estate on the edge of town. The house had been vacant for years and was surrounded by rumors of hauntings and strange occurrences. We were all excited, though a bit apprehensive. I'd heard the stories, disembodied voices, flickering lights, and ghostly figures, but we wanted to see for ourselves. As we approached the estate, the tall, iron gates creaked open as if inviting us in. The house was a massive Victorian with ornate turrets and broken windows, casting eerie shadows in the dying light. We parked the car and, with flashlights in hand, made our way up the crumbling path. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked, glancing nervously at the darkening sky. "Come on, it'll be fun," Jake said, trying to mask his own nerves with bravado. The front door was slightly ajar, and with a deep breath, we pushed it open. The hinges protested with a long, mournful groan. Inside, the air was musty, filled with the scent of decay and dust. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating old furniture draped in sheets and portraits of long-gone inhabitants whose eyes seemed to follow us. We wandered through the main rooms, commenting on the house's condition and making light of its creepy appearance. It wasn't until we reached the basement door that things started to get unsettling. The door was solid, old, and partially ajar, with an odd draft emanating from below. "I say we check it out," Jake suggested, eager to prove his courage. The stairs creaked ominously under our weight as we descended into the basement. It was a large, cavernous space cluttered with old trunks, broken furniture, and a few boxes covered in cobwebs. The air was colder down here, and the silence was almost palpable. "Look at this," Emily called out, pointing to an old mirror leaning against the wall. The mirror was covered in grime, its ornate frame partially obscured by dust. I wiped the patch clean, revealing a reflection of the basement, but something was off. There was a figure behind us in the mirror, shadowy, indistinct form that seemed to move as we did. "Guys, look at this," I said, my voice trembling. Sarah and Jake crowded around. "That's just a trick of the light," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. As we stared at the mirror, a sudden loud bang echoed from upstairs. We jumped, our flashlights flickering. "What was that?" Emily asked, her face pale. "I don't know," I said. "Maybe it's the house settling." We decided to investigate, climbing the stairs back to the main floor. The noise had stopped, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. We moved cautiously through the house, our footsteps echoing off the walls. "Maybe it was an animal or the wind," Sarah suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. We were about to leave when we heard a low, mournful wail coming from somewhere within the house. It was almost like a human voice, but distorted and distant. We froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. "I think we should go," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I agree," I said, feeling a chill run down my spine. We hurried back to the front door, but as we reached it, the door slammed shut on its own. We all jumped, and the wailing grew louder. Our flashlights danced erratically as we tried to find a way out. "Is someone playing a prank on us?" Jake asked, but his question was lost in the growing panic. With a final push, we managed to open the front door and stumbled outside. The night air felt incredibly refreshing after the stifling atmosphere inside the house. We gathered by the car, our breath visible in the cool air, trying to calm our racing hearts. As we drove away, none of us spoke much. The house, with its shadowy figure and eerie sounds, had left a lasting impression. We never went back, and though we continued to talk about our experience, the true nature of what we encountered remained a mystery. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that something was watching us from within those walls, something old and restless. The Miller estate remains a haunting memory, a reminder that some places hold a darkness that defies explanation, but that we all survived to tell the tale. It was just another routine evening when my friends and I decided to take a detour on our drive back from a weekend trip. We had heard about an old, abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town, just the sort of place to satisfy our craving for a thrill. We'd laughed off the ghost stories and eerie legends, confident that it would be nothing more than a spooky but harmless adventure. The asylum was a towering, crumbling structure, its Gothic architecture overgrown with ivy. The iron gates were rusted and slightly ajar, which made it easy for us to slip inside. The setting sun cast long shadows, and the air was thick with a musty, oppressive silence. We entered through the main lobby, where the air was cool and filled with the scent of mildew. The once grand space was now covered in layers of dust and debris. Shattered light fixtures hung from the ceiling, and old medical equipment lay scattered on the floor. Despite the decay, there was something unsettling about the place, something that made my skin prickle. "This is insane," Jake said, his voice echoing through the empty halls. "Let's check out the basement." I hesitated. The basement, with its reputation for being the most haunted part of the asylum, was a place I'd hoped to avoid. But the thrill of exploration won out, and we headed down the creaky stairs. The basement was cold and dark, illuminated only by the beam of our flashlights. It was a maze of empty rooms and storage closets, filled with broken furniture and old files. We were in the middle of examining a dusty old office when we heard a loud bang from somewhere deeper in the basement. The sound echoed off the walls, sending a shiver down my spine. "Probably just a settling noise," Sarah suggested, though her voice was unsteady. We moved toward the source of the noise, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air grew colder, and an uncomfortable feeling of being watched settled over us. The basement felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing in with an almost tangible sense of dread. We entered a large, decrepit room that had once been used for medical procedures. The room was filled with old, rusty equipment and broken glass. As we swept our flashlights across the room, I noticed something strange, a faint, shimmering light in the far corner. "Look at that," I said, pointing toward the light. The light seemed to pulse and flicker, almost as if it were alive. We approached cautiously, our footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. As we got closer, the light seemed to coalesce into a dim, ghostly figure. It was barely discernible, like a wisp of smoke or a shadow. "What is that?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before I could answer, the figure flickered out, leaving only darkness behind. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and a cold draft swept through, extinguishing our flashlights one by one. Panic set in. We scrambled to relight our flashlights, but the darkness was nearly complete. The feeling of being watched intensified, and the oppressive silence was occasionally broken by distant, eerie noises. "Okay, we need to get out of here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We stumbled our way back toward the stairs, our breaths visible in the cold air. Just as we reached the top of the stairs, we heard a final, loud crash from below, like something heavy had been dropped or thrown. We raced up the stairs and out of the asylum, emerging into the night air. As we stood outside, catching our breaths, the sense of relief was palpable. The asylum loomed behind us, dark and silent. We didn't speak much on the drive home. The asylum had left an impression that none of us could easily shake. The ghostly figure, the chilling cold, and the oppressive feeling of being watched stayed with us long after we'd left. Though we all made it out safely, the experience was a stark reminder that some places are better left unexplored. The asylum, with its eerie light and unsettling atmosphere, was a place where the line between reality and the supernatural seemed to blur. It was an adventure we would never forget, a haunting experience that made us question the boundaries of the known and the unknown. I've always been a bit of a thrill seeker, so when my friends and I heard about the old, abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town, we couldn't resist exploring it. The place had been closed for decades, a relic of the past that had been left to decay. It was rumored to be haunted, which only added to the allure. We planned our visit for a night when the moon was full, hoping for an extra layer of eeriness. We arrived at the asylum just as twilight began to fade. The building loomed ahead, its once grand facade now crumbling and overgrown with ivy. The gates, rusted and hanging off their hinges, creaked as we pushed through. We were a group of 5, equipped with flashlights, cameras, and a healthy dose of bravado. As we entered the asylum, the air felt colder, and a musty odor filled our nostrils. The hallways were dark, the only light coming from our flashlights slicing through the oppressive darkness. We moved cautiously, our footsteps echoing off the walls. Each room was more unsettling than the last, dust-covered furniture, peeling wallpaper, and the occasional scrawled message from previous visitors. It wasn't until we reached the basement that things took a turn. The stairs were steep and narrow, leading into absolute darkness. We descended slowly, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom, we found a series of small rooms filled with old medical equipment, trusty gurneys, cracked for stands, and ancient medical charts. We were in the middle of examining one of the rooms when we heard a faint whisper, almost like a voice calling out from the darkness. We froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. "Did anyone else hear that?" Jake asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Probably just the wind," Sarah suggested, though her eyes betrayed her unease. We continued exploring, but the whispering grew louder, more insistent. It felt as though the sound was following us, moving from room to room. My flashlight flickered, and the temperature seemed to drop even further. In one of the smaller rooms, we found an old, rusted door partially hidden behind a stack of broken furniture. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to open it. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow corridor that seemed to extend into the bowels of the asylum. As we moved down the corridor, the whispers grew louder, morphing into a low, continuous murmur. The darkness seemed to press in on us, and the walls felt like they were closing in. My flashlight's beam cut through the gloom, but the corridor seemed to stretch on endlessly. We finally reached the end of the corridor, where we found a small room with a single window. The window was covered in grime, but through the filth, we could make out the night sky. It was a moment of relief until we noticed something on the floor, an old journal, its cover stained and brittle. I picked up the journal, my hands trembling slightly. As I opened it, I saw that it was filled with handwritten notes, some of them barely legible. The entries described experiments and procedures carried out on patients, with references to strange occurrences and unsettling happenings. The last entry was hastily scrawled. "They are watching. I can feel their eyes." A chill ran down my spine. Just then, the whispers intensified, rising to a cacophony of disembodied voices. My flashlight flickered wildly, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. "We need to get out of here," Emily said, her voice trembling. We all agreed, and we quickly made our way back to the stairs. The whispers seemed to follow us, growing louder and more frantic. As we climbed the stairs, the temperature returned to normal, and the whispers faded. We emerged from the asylum, gasping for fresh air. Once outside, we huddled together, trying to make sense of what had happened. The sense of relief at being outside was palpable, but we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The asylum, with its dark corridors and eerie whispers, had left an indelible mark on us. We never went back to the asylum, and none of us spoke much about that night. The whispers and the sense of being watched remained with us, a reminder that some places hold on to something beyond our understanding. The experience served as a chilling reminder that curiosity can sometimes lead us to places best left unexplored. In the summer of 2022, my friends and I decided to explore an abandoned asylum on the outskirts of our town. It was a popular spot for thrill seekers and urban explorers, and while we were all a bit apprehensive, we were also excited. Little did we know that this would turn into a night we would never forget. We arrived at the asylum just as the sun was setting. The building loomed before us, a decaying structure with broken windows and rusted gates. As we approached, the sky darkened quickly, and an uneasy feeling settled over us. "Are we sure about this?" Lisa asked, her voice wavering as she looked at the shadowy outline of the asylum. "It'll be fine," I reassured her. "We'll just stick together and be out before midnight." The asylum's entrance was a gaping maw, and we hesitated before stepping inside. The interior was as we'd expected, dusty, with peeling wallpaper and creaking floorboards. We had brought flashlights, and their beams cut through the darkness as we explored the crumbling hallways. We ventured deeper into the asylum, our footsteps echoing off the walls. Each room was filled with old medical equipment, rusted beds, and remnants of a time long past. Despite the eerie atmosphere, we were having fun, making jokes and snapping photos. It was when we reached the old electroshock therapy room that things started to get strange. The room was filled with ancient machines, their metal parts twisted and broken. In the center of the room was a large chair, its straps still attached. The sight of it made my skin crawl. "Let's take a photo here," Jake suggested, trying to lighten the mood. As we posed for the picture, The lights flickered. We all laughed it off, but the air seemed to grow colder. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I shrugged it off, attributing it to the drafty building. We continued exploring, finding more unsettling sights, patient records scattered across the floor, old staff uniforms, and strange symbols painted on the walls. It was fascinating but increasingly disturbing. Our adventure took a turn when we stumbled upon the basement stairs. The stairs were steep and narrow, descending into total darkness. I hesitated but eventually decided to check it out. We switched on our flashlights and descended, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. At the bottom, we found a large, dimly lit room filled with old filing cabinets and broken furniture. There was an unsettling stillness in the air. We spread out, looking through the drawers, when we heard a soft, rhythmic noise, a tapping sound, like someone knocking on a door. The tapping grew louder and more insistent. We looked at each other, and easy. Is anyone else hearing that? Lisa asked, her voice trembling. Yeah, but it's probably just the building settling, Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. We moved towards the source of the noise, our flashlights flickering in the dim light. The tapping seemed to come from a small storage closet at the end of the room. I approached the closet and, with a deep breath, opened the door. Inside, there was nothing but old, dusty supplies. The tapping stopped abruptly as the door swung open. We all stood there, bewildered, trying to make sense of what we'd just experienced. Suddenly, the lights flickered more violently, and we heard a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from the very walls of the asylum. The sound was chilling, and the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. We huddled together, our fear palpable. This place is giving me the creeps, Lisa said, her voice barely above a whisper. We should get out, I agreed, trying to stay calm. Now, we hurried back upstairs, our steps echoing in the empty halls. The asylum seemed to come alive with strange noises, whispers, creaks, and the occasional distant bang. As we exited the building, the night air felt like a breath of fresh air, and we didn't stop until we were safely back in the parking lot. We sat in the car, our nerves still frayed from the experience. We couldn't explain what we had heard or felt in that basement. The asylum, with its eerie atmosphere and strange sounds, had left us with an unsettling feeling that stayed with us long after we left. The next day, we found out that the asylum had been the site of numerous experiments and was notorious for its troubled history. Some of the stories seemed to match our experience, but we still couldn't be sure of what we had encountered. We all agreed that while the adventure had been thrilling, it was also a stark reminder of how unsettling places like that can be. We never went back to the asylum, and to this day, the memory of the strange noises and the cold, oppressive air of that basement remains with us, a chilling reminder of the night we ventured into the unknown. It was a chilly October night in 2014 when my friends and I decided to spend the evening at the old Mitchell House, a Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town. The house had long been rumored to be haunted, and we were eager to put the local legends to the test. We didn't expect to find anything more than a few creaks and groans from an old house, but what we experienced that night was far more unsettling. Mitchell House had been vacant for decades. It stood on a hill, shrouded in overgrown ivy and surrounded by a wrought iron fence. As we approached, the moonlight cast long shadows across the property, and the mansion's tall, dark windows seemed to watch us. We had heard that the house was built in the late 1800s by a wealthy industrialist who vanished mysteriously. Since then, strange occurrences and ghostly sightings had been reported by anyone brave enough to venture close. We entered through the front door, which creaked ominously as we pushed it open. Inside, the air was musty, filled with the scent of mold and decay. The grand foyer was decorated with faded wallpaper and dusty furniture. We set up a few flashlights and a couple of cameras, ready to document our adventure. Our group consisted of me, Jake, Emily, and Sarah. We decided to split up to explore different parts of the house. I took the upstairs with Emily, while Jake and Sarah stayed downstairs. We agreed to meet back in the foyer in an hour. As we ascended the staircase, the wooden steps groaned under our weight. The second floor was a maze of dimly lit corridors and closed doors. We explored each room, finding nothing more than old furniture covered in white sheets. The atmosphere was heavy, and every small sound seemed amplified in the silence. We entered a bedroom with a large, antique bed and a cracked mirror hanging over a dusty dresser. Emily went to investigate the mirror while I checked the closet. As I opened the closet door, a cold draft swept through the room, causing the hairs on the back of my neck to stand on end. Did you feel that? I asked Emily. Yeah, it's freezing in here, she replied, shivering slightly. We continued our exploration, and that's when we heard it, a loud bang from downstairs, followed by what sounded like a low, guttural moan. We exchanged uneasy glances. "Let's go check on Jake and Sarah," I suggested as we hurried down the stairs. The house seemed to come alive. The temperature dropped even further, and the air grew dense with an unsettling stillness. We reached the foyer and found Jake and Sarah looking pale and shaken. "What happened?" I asked. "Something strange," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We heard noises coming from the basement. It sounded like something was moving around." We all stared at each other, the weight of our situation sinking in. Despite our fear, we decided to investigate the basement. The staircase leading down was narrow and steep, and the wooden steps felt brittle under our feet. We turned on our flashlights and made our way to the basement door, which creaked open with a disturbing slowness. The basement was a large, dark space filled with old boxes, broken furniture, and cobwebs. The air was colder here, and our breaths fogged up in front of us. We scanned the room with our flashlights, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Then, out of nowhere, a loud crash echoed through the basement, making us all jump. Our flashlights flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. We turned to see a large crate that had fallen over, its contents spilling onto the floor. As we moved closer, we saw that it was filled with old, decaying books and papers. "I think we've seen enough," Emily said, her voice trembling. "Let's get out of here." We hurried back up the stairs, and as we reached the foyer, we noticed the front door was slightly ajar. We exchanged worried glances, realizing that we had all heard the same noises, but no one had been near the door. We decided it was best to leave immediately. We quickly packed up our equipment and left Mitchell House, the eerie feeling lingering long after we had driven away. To this day, I can't explain what we experienced in that house. The noises, the cold spots, and the feeling of being watched were unsettling. But no one was hurt, and nothing harmful happened to us. Mitchell House remains a mystery, a place where the past and the unknown seem to intertwine. We all agreed that some places are best left undisturbed, and that night at the Mitchell House is one we'll never forget. It was a few years ago when my friends and I decided to explore an old, abandoned mental asylum on the outskirts of town. We'd heard rumors about the place being haunted, but we were all seasoned skeptics looking for a thrill. The asylum had been closed for decades, and the stories surrounding it were a mix of urban legend and local folklore. We arrived at dusk, the sun sinking behind a blanket of clouds. The building loomed before us, its Gothic architecture silhouetted against the dimming sky. Vines and weeds had overtaken the grounds, and the windows were shattered or boarded up. Despite the oppressive atmosphere, we were excited, eager to uncover the truth behind the stories. "Let's get in before it's completely dark," said Jake, always the ringleader of our group. We found a broken window in the rear of the asylum and climbed inside. The air was musty, heavy with the scent of decay. The hallway stretched out before us, lined with peeling paint and rotting wood. We turned on our flashlights, the beams cutting through the thick darkness. "Anyone else feeling like we're being watched?" Emily whispered. "Just your imagination," I said, though I couldn't completely shake off the unease. We explored the lower floors, each room more dilapidated than the last. Old medical equipment lay strewn about, and the walls were covered in faded, eerie murals. It was clear that the asylum had once been a place of suffering, but nothing particularly unsettling happened until we reached the upper floors. The stairs creaked under our weight as we ascended. The upper floors were in even worse condition, with parts of the ceiling sagging dangerously. We came to a large, decrepit ward, its rows of empty beds and rusting metal frames giving it a ghostly appearance that looks like something out of a horror movie. Jake said, shining his flashlight around. We joked and laughed nervously, trying to keep the mood light. But as we ventured deeper into the ward, we found a door slightly ajar, leading to a small, dark room. The air was colder here, and a chill ran down my spine. "Let's see what's in there," Sarah suggested. The door opened with a reluctant groan. Inside, we found a dusty old office with a single desk and a broken typewriter. On the desk was a stack of yellowed papers and a small, antique mirror. Who uses a mirror in a place like this? I wondered aloud. Jake picked up the mirror and wiped away some of the grime. Maybe it's a relic from when the place was still operational. As he held up the mirror, the light from our flashlights cast eerie reflections around the room. The mirror was old and ornate, with an elaborate frame. It was then that I noticed something strange in the reflection. Behind Jake was a dark, shadowy figure. "Jake, Look behind you, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Jake turned around, but the room was empty. The figure was gone. He shrugged, attributing it to a trick of the light. Let's move on, he said, though his voice was a bit shaky. We left the room, but the strange feeling persisted. The shadows seemed to move in the corners of our vision, and the air grew colder with each passing minute. We explored a few more rooms but found nothing of interest. Maybe it's time to head out, Emily suggested, her unease evident. As we made our way back toward the exit, the building seemed to grow even darker. The oppressive silence was occasionally broken by distant creaks and groans of the old structure settling. When we reached the broken window, we climbed out one by one, our nerves frayed. As we gathered outside, we looked back at the asylum. The once ominous building now seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy. We walked back to our car, the moonlight casting long shadows over the overgrown lawn. The drive home was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. We never spoke much about what we had seen, but the experience left a lasting impression on us. To this day, I can't explain the shadowy figure we saw in the mirror, or the strange feeling that pervaded the asylum. It was an encounter with the unknown, something that defied logical explanation. Despite our escape unscathed, I've never been able to shake the feeling that something was watching us from within those dark, abandoned halls. My friends and I had always been drawn to abandoned places, driven by a morbid curiosity rather than belief in ghosts. So when we heard about the old Greystone Manor on the outskirts of town, rumored to be haunted, we saw it as a perfect adventure. Greystone Manor was a crumbling, Gothic structure, hidden away at the end of a long, overgrown driveway. The estate had been abandoned for decades, and the stories about it ranged from eerie to downright terrifying. Some claimed the place was cursed, others whispered of a tragic event that had taken place there. We were skeptical, but the allure of exploring an old, spooky house was too tempting. On a chilly, moonlit night, we made our way to the manor. The air was thick with fog, which only added to the sense of foreboding. As we approached the house, the grandeur of its once magnificent facade was now obscured by vines and decay. The front door was ajar, creaking softly with every gust of wind. We should be cautious, Emma said, trying to mask her nervousness. Let's stick together. We nodded in agreement and stepped inside. The interior was just as we had imagined, dusty, cobwebbed, and eerily quiet. The floorboards groaned under our weight as we made our way through the dimly lit rooms. Our flashlights cut through the gloom, illuminating old furniture draped in sheets and faded, ornate wallpaper. It was when we reached the second floor that things began to feel off. The temperature dropped significantly, and a strange stillness hung in the air. We were exploring one of the larger rooms when I noticed a faint, rhythmic sound coming from down the hallway. It was a soft, monotonous tapping. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Everyone paused and listened. The tapping continued, seemingly coming from behind a closed door at the end of the hall. We approached the door cautiously, our footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. "Should we open it?" Jake asked, his face showing a mix of excitement and fear. Before anyone could answer, the tapping abruptly stopped. We stood still, listening to the silence. With a deep breath, I turned the door handle and pushed it open. The room was empty, except for a large, old wardrobe against the far wall. I approached the wardrobe, drawn by an inexplicable urge to see what was inside. The wardrobe creaked as I opened it, revealing nothing but a few moth-eaten coats and a stack of old, yellowed newspapers. "Nothing here," I said, a bit relieved but still uneasy. As we turned to leave, the tapping started again, this time coming from the direction we had just come. It was louder, more insistent. Our flashlights flickered as we made our way back down the hall, the sound growing louder with each step. We reached the staircase, and that's when we saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the top of the stairs, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and indistinct, blending with the darkness. My heart raced, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "Is someone there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, its presence unnervingly still. We slowly backed away, our breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. As we retreated, the figure dissolved into the shadows, and the tapping sound stopped abruptly. We didn't wait to see if it reappeared. We hurried down the stairs and out of the manor, our hearts pounding in our chests. The night air outside was a welcome relief, and we all took a moment to catch our breath. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, trying to shake off the lingering fear. "But we should probably get out of here," We left Greystone Manor behind, and though we talked about it for days afterward, none of us could come up with a rational explanation for what we had experienced. The shadowy figure and the persistent tapping remained a mystery, a chilling reminder of the eerie atmosphere that had pervaded the house. Despite our fear, we all made it out safely, and the experience became a story we shared with a mix of thrill and trepidation. Greystone Manor remained abandoned, its secrets intact, and we all agreed that some places are best left unexplored. It was a dark, quiet night when my friends and I decided to investigate the old, abandoned house at the edge of town. The house had been empty for decades, its paint peeling and windows boarded up. The locals whispered about strange occurrences and sightings, but we were young and skeptical. We thought we were just going on a harmless adventure. The night was still as we approached the house. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. The front door creaked open with a groan that seemed to echo through the silent night. We stepped inside, our footsteps muffled by layers of dust and debris. "Let's check out the basement first," Jake suggested, always the thrill seeker of the group. The basement door was heavy and groaned as we pushed it open. We descended the stairs, each step creaking loudly. The basement was cold and damp, filled with old furniture covered in white sheets and broken boxes. The air was thick with the smell of mildew. As we explored, we found a door partially hidden behind an old wardrobe. It was small and looked ancient, its wooden surface cracked and worn. With some effort, we managed to pry it open, revealing a tiny room cluttered with old books and faded photographs. On a dusty shelf in the corner sat an old, ornate mirror. Its frame was intricately carved, and it had a strange, unsettling quality. "Look at this," Emily said, pointing to the mirror. "It's like something out of a horror movie." We gathered around the mirror, and I wiped away some of the thick dust. The glass was cloudy, but as the light from our flashlights hit it, I noticed something odd. The reflection showed not just the room, but a faint, shadowy figure standing behind us. I turned quickly, but the room was empty. "Did anyone else see that?" I asked, my voice betraying my unease. "See what?" Jake asked, peering over my shoulder. "There was something in the reflection," I said. "I'm not sure what it was." We all looked at the mirror again, but it showed nothing out of the ordinary. We laughed nervously, trying to brush it off as a trick of the light. However, the atmosphere in the basement felt heavier, almost oppressive. As we decided to leave, we heard a loud bang from upstairs. It sounded like something had fallen, and the noise echoed through the empty house. We froze, our flashlights flickering. "Probably just the house settling," Sarah said, though her voice was shaky. We decided to investigate the noise, our curiosity overcoming our fear. As we climbed the stairs, the house seemed to come alive with creaks and groans. The banging continued intermittently, growing louder and more erratic. When we reached the top of the stairs, the noise stopped abruptly. We carefully moved through the darkened rooms, each shadow seeming to hold secrets. The house was still, save for the occasional rustle of what we assumed were rats. Finally, we reached the front door, ready to leave. As we stood on the porch, the wind picked up, and the door slammed shut behind us with a resounding thud. We jumped, and I noticed the mirror, which we had left in the basement, was now visible through a gap in the doorway. I could see the reflection of the front yard in the mirror. For a brief moment, the shadowy figure appeared again, this time more distinct. It seemed to be watching us from the corner of the room, its presence almost palpable. "Let's get out of here," I said, feeling a cold sweat forming on my brow. We hurried back to the car, glancing over our shoulders as we went. The eerie feeling of being watched lingered as we drove away, and we didn't stop until we were safely back in town. The experience left us shaken. We never returned to the house, and though we later heard rumors that it had been torn down, I still wonder about the figure in the mirror. It was an unsettling reminder that some places seem to hold on to something beyond our understanding, and some reflections reveal more than just what's in front of them. It was a crisp autumn evening when my friends and I decided to visit an old, supposedly haunted house on the outskirts of town. The house had been vacant for decades, and stories of strange occurrences had circulated among locals for as long as I could remember. Despite the rumors, we were determined to see if the stories held any truth. The house itself was a large Victorian with peeling paint and overgrown ivy. Its windows were dark, and the porch sagged under the weight of neglect. As we approached, a chill swept through the air, though it wasn't particularly cold. We parked our car a safe distance away and walked up the creaky steps. Inside, the house was even more eerie. Dust motes danced in the narrow beams of our flashlights as we explored. The rooms were filled with old furniture covered in white sheets, and cobwebs hung from the corners of the ceiling. The atmosphere was heavy, almost oppressive, but we pressed on, driven by curiosity. The basement door was the only one that seemed oddly out of place. It was partially ajar, and a faint, musty odor wafted up from the darkened stairs. I shivered but led the group down. Each step we took seemed to echo louder than the last, amplifying the unsettling silence. The basement was cluttered with old trunks, broken furniture, and shelves of rusted cans. In the far corner, obscured by a pile of boxes, was an old mirror with a tarnished frame. I couldn't resist examining it. The mirror was caked in grime, but I wiped away a small patch, revealing a tarnished, but still reflective surface. "Hey, check this out," I said, motioning for my friends to come over. They gathered around, and we stared at the mirror. At first, it reflected only the dusty basement, but then I noticed something strange in the corner of the reflection. There was a dark shape, like a shadow, moving slowly behind us. I glanced over my shoulder, but the basement was empty. "Do you see that?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "See what?" Jake asked, peering into the mirror. The shadowy shape was still there, and it seemed to grow clearer with each passing second. It was a vague, indistinct form, like smoke swirling in the dim light. "Guys, I think we should get out of here," Emily said, her voice trembling slightly. We decided to leave, though the shadowy figure in the mirror continued to haunt my thoughts. As we turned to head back upstairs, a loud bang echoed through the basement. It sounded like something heavy had fallen, but when we looked, nothing had changed. "I'm really not liking this," Sarah said, her face pale. "Let's just go," I suggested, my own anxiety mounting. We hurried up the stairs, but the house seemed to groan and creak as if it were alive. The front door, which had been slightly ajar, was now firmly shut. We pushed against it, and it finally gave way with a screech. Outside, the night air felt strangely warm and comforting. We huddled together, our breath visible in the crisp air. As we stood by the car, I glanced back at the house. The dark windows seemed to watch us, and a sense of unease lingered in my chest. We drove away quickly, the house receding into the darkness behind us. We didn't speak much during the drive, each of us lost in our thoughts. The shadow in the mirror and the loud bang remained vivid in my mind. Later that night, back at home, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I researched the house and found that it had a history of strange events, disappearances, and unexplained noises. The stories seemed to match what we had experienced, but I still felt a deep unease. To this day, the memory of that mirror and the shadowy figure remains vivid. We all made it out safely, but the encounter left a lasting impression. Sometimes, I wonder if we disturbed something that was best left alone, or if the house itself had a darker presence that we were never meant to understand. It was an experience that taught me to respect the unknown and to trust my instincts when something feels off. It was a crisp fall evening when my friends and I decided to explore the old Hawkins mansion, a local legend of eerie tales and ghost stories. The mansion had been abandoned for years, its windows boarded up and its grounds overgrown. Despite our skepticism, the allure of an authentic haunted house was too tempting. We arrived at the mansion just as the sun began to set. The place was more intimidating up close, with its Gothic architecture and ivy-clad walls. We parked a safe distance away and approached the front entrance, our flashlights barely piercing the encroaching twilight. "Are we really doing this?" Sarah asked, her voice wavering. "Absolutely," I replied, trying to sound braver than I felt. "It'll be fun." We managed to force the creaky front door open and stepped into the foyer. The inside was as unsettling as the exterior. Cobwebs hung from every corner, and a thick layer of dust covered the old furniture. The air was musty, and our flashlights cast long, jittery shadows on the walls. We explored the first floor, finding nothing more menacing than a few broken antiques and torn curtains. The sense of dread that had initially gripped us started to wane, and we began to relax, laughing nervously and making light of the spooky setting. It was when we ventured to the second floor that things took a turn. The staircase was narrow and steep, the steps creaking ominously under our weight. The second floor was in even worse condition, with peeling wallpaper and rooms filled with rotting furniture. As we entered one of the bedrooms, I noticed a small, ornate mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. Its frame was tarnished, and the glass was smeared with grime. I wiped the patch clean, and what I saw made my stomach drop. The reflection showed not just the room, but a shadowy figure standing behind us. Double quotes, "Hey, look at this." I called out to the others, my voice shaking. Everyone gathered around, their flashlights reflecting off the dirty mirror. At first, they saw nothing unusual. But then, Emily gasped, "What's that?" We all stared into the mirror, and the figure seemed to shift slightly, its shape indistinct but undeniably there. It was as though it was made of darkness itself, a formless entity lurking just out of sight. "This is freaky," Jake said, his voice tense. Before anyone could respond, a loud bang echoed from downstairs. We froze, our hearts pounding. The noise was followed by what sounded like footsteps, heavy and deliberate. "Maybe it's just the house settling," Sarah suggested. Though her voice betrayed her fear, we decided to investigate the noise, cautiously making our way back down the stairs. The footsteps seemed to follow us, growing louder and more insistent. We reached the ground floor, and the noise abruptly stopped. The house was silent once more, the eerie calm almost more unsettling than the noise had been. "What the hell was that?" Emily whispered. "I don't know," I said, trying to remain composed. "But let's get out of here." We quickly headed back to the front door, our nerves on edge. As we reached the entrance, the house seemed to groan and creak around us, as if protesting our departure. The shadowy figure in the mirror flashed through my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling of something watching us, lingering just beyond the edges of our perception. We spilled out into the night, our breaths visible in the cold air. We hurried back to the car, glancing over our shoulders as we left. The mansion stood silent and dark, its windows like empty eyes staring after us as we drove away. We talked nervously about what we'd seen and heard. None of us could explain the shadowy figure or the footsteps that had seemed to follow us. Despite our best efforts to rationalize the experience, the feeling of dread lingered long after we'd left. We never went back to the Hawkins mansion, and though we continued to share stories of our eerie adventure, the memory of that shadowy figure and the unnerving noises remained with us. It was a stark reminder that some places seem to hold on to something beyond our understanding, and that some mysteries are best left unexplored. It was a chilly evening when my friends and I decided to explore the old, abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town. The place had been vacant for years, and the tales of its dark history were well known among locals. We were all thrill seekers, and the idea of spending a night in such a notorious location seemed like the ultimate adventure. We arrived just as the sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows across the overgrown grounds. The asylum's facade loomed ahead, its broken windows and crumbling walls a stark reminder of its grim past. We parked our car a few hundred yards away, hoping to avoid detection from any curious passers-by. The main entrance was ajar, barely hanging on its hinges. We pushed it open and stepped inside, the musty smell of decay hitting us immediately. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating peeling paint, moldy floors, and rusted metal furniture. The atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating, but we pressed on, our excitement overcoming the unease. The first floor was unsettling but unremarkable. We wandered through empty rooms filled with discarded medical equipment and old, dusty furniture. It wasn't until we found the stairway leading to the basement that things started to feel different. The stairs creaked under our weight as we descended into the darkness. The basement was colder and more oppressive than the upper floors. We moved cautiously, the beams of our flashlights catching glimpses of broken furniture and strange, old markings on the walls. Then, we found a heavy, rusted door partially hidden behind a stack of debris. "This must be it," Jake said, his voice echoing in the damp, cold air. The morgue. With some effort, we managed to pry open the door. The room beyond was filled with old gurneys and metal drawers, some of them slightly ajar. The sight was macabre, but our curiosity got the better of us. We explored the room, poking into old drawers and taking photos. That's when the temperature dropped suddenly. Our breath became visible, and an icy chill filled the room. The oppressive feeling grew stronger, as though the air itself had become heavier. I noticed a faint, rhythmic noise, a low thumping that seemed to come from the walls. "Do you guys hear that?" I asked, trying to mask my growing anxiety. Everyone paused and listened. The thumping continued, growing louder and more insistent. It was almost like a heartbeat, pulsing through the walls. Before anyone could react, the lights from our flashlights flickered and went out. We were plunged into darkness, the oppressive cold intensifying. Panic began to set in as we fumbled with our equipment, trying to get the lights back on. The thumping grew louder, now accompanied by a soft, mournful wail that seemed to fill the entire basement. It felt as though the walls themselves were vibrating with the sound. My heart raced, and I could feel my friend's fear mounting as well. "Let's get out of here," Emily whispered urgently, her voice trembling. We quickly gathered our things and made our way back to the stairs. The cold was unbearable, and the thumping continued to follow us, growing louder with each step. As we reached the top of the stairs, the lights flickered back on, revealing the empty, decaying hallway. The wailing had stopped, leaving only the echo of our footsteps behind. We didn't stop to investigate further. We hurried out of the asylum, the feeling of being watched never leaving us. As we reached the safety of our car, we glanced back at the asylum, its dark windows seeming to stare back at us. The drive back was filled with nervous chatter and attempts to rationalize what we had experienced. None of us could explain the thumping or the wailing, but we all felt a shared sense of relief at having escaped. To this day, the memory of that night lingers. The asylum stands as a haunting reminder of the unknown, a place where the past seems to linger in ways that defy explanation. We all made it out safely, but the feeling of dread and the eerie sounds we encountered will forever remain a chilling part of our adventure. I never believed in ghosts until that night. My friends and I had decided to take a road trip to a small, historic town known for its old landmarks and eerie legends. Our destination was the old Whitmore Mansion, a crumbling estate on the edge of town that had been abandoned for decades. Rumor had it that strange things happened there, but we were skeptics, looking for a bit of thrill and a good story. We arrived at the mansion just before dusk. The house stood in a sprawling, overgrown yard, its once grand architecture now marred by neglect. The windows were boarded up, and the paint was peeling, giving it an almost sinister appearance. We parked a few hundred yards away and approached on foot, our flashlights piercing the gathering darkness. The front door was ajar, creaking softly as we pushed it open. The inside was as we expected, dusty and cobwebbed, filled with old furniture draped in sheets. We wandered through the first floor, our footsteps echoing in the emptiness. There was nothing unusual until we found the staircase leading to the basement. "Let's check it out," said Jake, his eyes gleaming with excitement. The rest of us, though apprehensive, followed. The basement stairs were narrow and steep, and the air grew colder as we descended. At the bottom, we found a large room cluttered with old boxes, broken furniture, and strange, rusted objects. There was an unsettling atmosphere, amplified by the strange, almost musty smell. In one corner of the room was a large mirror with a tarnished, ornate frame. It was covered in dust, but I was drawn to it. I wiped the section clean, revealing a reflection that showed not only us but also a dark shape standing behind us, barely visible. "Guys, come look at this," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. When they gathered around, the shape was still there, but no one else was in the room. We all stared at the reflection, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. The figure seemed to shift, moving slightly as if it were aware of us. "That's just a trick of the light," Sarah said, though her voice wavered. We decided to move on, though the sight of the figure left us uneasy. As we explored the basement, we heard a faint, rhythmic thumping sound, like something beating against the walls. We paused, listening intently, but the sound stopped as soon as we tried to locate it. "I think it's just the house settling," Jake suggested. Though none of us were convinced, we continued through the basement, but the thumping grew louder and more erratic. It felt as though something was moving around us, unseen. The atmosphere was oppressive, and the cold seemed to seep into our bones. As we moved back toward the stairs, the basement door suddenly slammed shut with a deafening bang. We jumped, our flashlights flickering. Panic set in as we tried to open the door, but it was stuck. "Okay, this is definitely not normal," Emily said, her voice trembling. We pounded on the door, shouting for someone to hear us, but there was no response. The thumping was now joined by a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from all around us. It felt as if the room itself was alive with the sound. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open slowly. We scrambled out of the basement, our hearts racing. The mansion felt different now, almost as if it were alive with a malevolent presence. Once outside, we stood in the yard, catching our breath. The night air felt refreshing compared to the stifling atmosphere inside. We laughed nervously, trying to make light of the situation, but the fear was still palpable. We decided it was best to leave the mansion and head back to our car. As we drove away, I glanced back at the house, now shrouded in darkness. The windows seemed to watch us, and the once familiar landscape felt foreign and menacing. That night, we stayed in a nearby motel, but none of us slept well. The events in the mansion replayed in our minds, and despite our attempt to rationalize them, we couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. To this day, I can't explain what we saw in that mirror or the sounds we heard. The experience left a lasting impression on me, a stark reminder that some places hold secrets that defy explanation. While we all made it out unharmed, the Whitmore Mansion remains an unsettling memory, a place where skepticism was met with something undeniably chilling. Last summer, my friends and I decided to explore the old, abandoned asylum just outside our town. The place had been vacant for decades, and its unsettling reputation had only grown over the years. The idea of exploring it felt thrilling, even if the stories about it were disturbing. We arrived just before dusk, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple. The asylum loomed ahead, its derelict facade both haunting and intriguing. The tall, iron gates creaked as we pushed them open, and the gravel path crunched under our feet. The building's broken windows and overgrown grounds gave it an air of very neglect. With flashlights in hand, we entered through a side door that had been left ajar. The inside was a labyrinth of dusty hallways and abandoned rooms, the air thick with mildew and decay. We moved cautiously, our footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. The first few hours were filled with the usual creaks and groans of an old building, but nothing particularly out of the ordinary. We joked and laughed, trying to ignore the unsettling atmosphere. It wasn't until we reached the basement that things took a turn. The basement stairs were narrow and steep, and the air grew colder as we descended. The basement was dark, lit only by the flickering beams of our flashlights. We began exploring the cluttered space, which was filled with old medical equipment and rusted metal shelves. In one corner, we found an old record player and a stack of dusty vinyl records. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to see if the player still worked. Jake, ever the optimist, wiped off the dust and managed to get it spinning. The crackling sound of the record filled the room, accompanied by an old, haunting melody. As the music played, and an easy feeling settled over us. We began to hear strange noises, soft, intermittent whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. We exchanged nervous glances, trying to brush it off as our imaginations running wild. Then, without warning, the music stopped. The record player spun to a halt, and a loud crash came from the far end of the basement. We jumped, our hearts racing. We directed our flashlights towards the sound, but saw only scattered debris. Probably just something falling over, Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. We moved cautiously toward the source of the noise. As we neared a large metal cabinet, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Our breaths became visible, and the whispers grew louder, almost as if they were trying to speak to us. Jake opened the cabinet door, revealing an old stack of medical files and rusty tools. Just then, the power in the building flickered and went out completely, plunging us into darkness. Panic set in as we scrambled to turn on our flashlights, but they sputtered and dimmed. In the pitch-black basement, the whispers turned into a low, mournful wail. It felt like the walls were closing in on us, the sound reverberating off every surface. We could hear faint shuffling noises, as if something or someone was moving just out of sight. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. We made our way back towards the stairs, our flashlights flickering weakly. The basement seemed to stretch endlessly, each step echoing louder in the oppressive darkness. The whispers and wails followed us, growing fainter as we climbed the stairs. When we finally reached the ground floor, the lights flickered back on, and the unsettling atmosphere lifted. We hurriedly made our way outside, relieved to be in the open air again. The asylum looked even more sinister in the fading light, its broken windows like hollow eyes watching us leave. We spent the rest of the evening discussing our experience, trying to make sense of what had happened. None of us could explain the noises or the sudden drop in temperature. We all agreed that the asylum was far creepier than we had anticipated. Despite the unsettling experience, we made it out safely, and nothing harmful came of our exploration. The asylum remains a topic of fascination and fear for us, a reminder of the eerie encounter we had in the abandoned halls. We never returned, but the memory of that night lingers, a haunting reminder that some places are better left unexplored. It was a chilly evening when my friends and I decided to explore the old McKinley estate. It was a sprawling mansion on the edge of town, long abandoned and steeped in local lore. According to legend, the last owner, a reclusive woman named Eliza McKinley, had vanished without a trace, and the estate was rumored to be haunted. We were intrigued by the stories, eager for a bit of adventure. We arrived as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the estate's overgrown gardens. The mansion was an imposing structure, with ivy crawling up its cracked walls and boarded-up windows that seemed to watch us. The front door was barely hanging on its hinges, creaking ominously as we pushed it open. Inside, the house was as eerie as expected. The air was heavy with dust, and the silence was almost palpable. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing faded wallpaper, broken furniture, and the remains of what might have been a grand chandelier. We made our way through the ground floor, laughing nervously and snapping photos. It wasn't until we found the staircase leading to the basement that the atmosphere shifted. The stairs descended into pitch blackness, and a musty odor wafted up. We hesitated but decided to check it out. After all, we were here for the full experience. We descended the stairs slowly, our footsteps echoing. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a large, dank room filled with old crates and cobweb-covered shelves. In one corner was a large mirror with a tarnished silver frame. The mirror was oddly pristine compared to everything else in the room. "Look at this," I said, motioning for the others to come over. As we gathered around the mirror, I noticed something strange. It was not only clean but seemed to have a peculiar, almost unnatural sheen. We took turns peering into it, each of us trying to figure out what was so unsettling about it. That's when we heard it, a soft, deliberate tapping sound. It was rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. We all froze, looking at each other in confusion and growing apprehension. "It's probably just the house settling," Jake said, trying to reassure us. But the tapping persisted, growing louder and more insistent. My heart raced as I shone my flashlight around the basement. The tapping seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Let's check it out," Emily suggested, though her voice wavered. We split up, each of us searching a different part of the basement while keeping the mirror in view. The tapping continued, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I felt as though something was watching us, lurking just beyond the edges of the light. I returned to the mirror, and as I approached, the tapping suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. I glanced into the mirror, and my blood ran cold. The reflection showed the room behind me, but there was a dark, indistinct shape hovering just out of view, barely visible. "Guys," I called out, my voice trembling. The others rushed back, their faces pale. We all stared at the mirror, trying to make sense of what we saw. The shape in the reflection seemed to move, its form shifting as if it were alive. We couldn't explain it, and the sense of dread grew stronger with each passing second. "We need to leave," Jake said urgently. We agreed, quickly ascending the stairs and leaving the basement behind. As we stepped outside, the cool night air felt like a balm against the suffocating atmosphere of the house. We drove away in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. The experience at the McKinley estate left us shaken. We later learned that the mansion had a history of unexplained occurrences and strange reflections, adding another layer of intrigue to the legend. Though we all made it out safely, the unsettling encounter with the mirror remains etched in my memory. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that something from that house followed us, a shadow lingering just beyond the edge of my vision. I remember it clearly, the old house on the outskirts of town, abandoned for years and rumored to be haunted. My friends and I had always been intrigued by its dark history, and one night, driven by curiosity and bravado, we decided to explore it. The house was a Victorian relic, its grandeur long faded. The once grand facade was now weathered and cracked, and the overgrown garden seemed to swallow the house in shadows. As we approached, the temperature seemed to drop, a chill that wasn't just from the late hour. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Emma asked, her voice tinged with anxiety. She was the most nervous of our group, and her unease was palpable. "Come on, it'll be fun," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "It's just an old house. What's the worst that could happen?" The front door, surprisingly, creaked open with a gentle push. Inside, the house was just as eerie as I'd imagined, dusty furniture draped in sheets, cobwebs hanging from the ceiling, and the smell of mildew pervading the air. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing faded wallpaper and old portraits with eyes that seemed to follow us. As we explored the ground floor, everything seemed normal, albeit unsettling. The air felt heavy, but we laughed it off, exchanging nervous jokes and trying to lighten the mood. It wasn't until we found the basement door that things took a turn. The basement was a dark, narrow space, filled with old boxes and rusted tools. The stairs creaked ominously as we descended, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom, we noticed an old, wooden trunk partially hidden behind some old furniture. "Let's see what's inside," Jake suggested. His curiosity piqued. We opened the trunk, and inside was a collection of old photographs and letters. The photographs were of a family from a bygone era, their faces stern and their eyes hauntingly vacant. The letters were yellowed with age, written in elegant, flowing script but filled with dark, cryptic messages. "Seems like a lot of old junk," Emily said, her voice echoing in the dimly lit space. "Yeah, but it's still pretty cool," Jake replied as we were about to close the trunk. A sudden, loud bang echoed from upstairs. We all jumped, and I noticed that the temperature in the basement had dropped even further. My breath fogged up in front of me, and the once unsettling atmosphere now felt genuinely sinister. "Did anyone else hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "It came from upstairs," I said, trying to sound calm. "Let's go check it out." We climbed the stairs cautiously, the old wood groaning under our weight. The sound of our footsteps seemed to amplify, creating an eerie rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart. As we reached the top, the house was silent again. The air was thick, almost as if it were holding its breath. We moved through the rooms, flashlights sweeping over dusty furniture and old portraits. The house was as it had been, but a sense of dread lingered in the corners. Just as we were about to leave, I noticed something strange, a shadow in one of the rooms, moving independently of our flashlights. "Guys, look at this," I said, pointing. The shadow seemed to be a dark, amorphous shape that shifted unnaturally against the wall. As we watched, it seemed to pulse and writhe, almost as if it were alive. I could hear a faint, almost imperceptible whispering that grew louder with each passing second. "Let's get out of here," Emma said urgently, grabbing my arm. We moved quickly towards the exit, the whispering growing more insistent, and the shadow more pronounced. As we reached the front door, it slammed shut with a thunderous bang. We all screamed, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. "Open the door," Jake shouted, panic evident in his voice. With a collective effort, we managed to force the door open. We stumbled out into the night, gasping for air as we fled the house. The temperature seemed to return to normal, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted as we reached the safety of the streetlights. We looked back at the house, its dark silhouette looming against the night sky. The windows seemed to watch us, and the whispers and shadows seemed to fade into the darkness. None of us spoke much as we drove away, the experience leaving us shaken but unharmed. The house remained a mystery, and though we survived our encounter, the eerie presence lingered in our minds. It was a night we would never forget, a reminder that some places are better left unexplored. A few years ago, my friends and I took a weekend trip to a cabin in the woods. It was meant to be a relaxing getaway, a chance to disconnect from our busy lives. The cabin was charming, set deep in the forest with a view of a serene lake. But as the weekend progressed, it turned into something much more unsettling. We arrived on a Friday afternoon. The cabin was quaint, with rustic furniture and a large stone fireplace. Everything seemed perfect until the sun set. As night fell, the woods outside grew dark and oppressive, with only the beam of our flashlights cutting through the gloom. That evening, we gathered around the fireplace, swapping stories and playing games. The fire crackled, and outside, the trees swayed gently in the wind. We had no reason to suspect anything was amiss. Around midnight, Sarah suggested we explore the woods a bit. Despite the late hour, we agreed, eager for a bit of adventure. We grabbed our flashlights and headed out, sticking to the well-trodden paths near the cabin. The woods were eerily quiet. The usual nighttime sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, seemed absent. It felt as if the forest was holding its breath. As we walked, we found an old trail that seemed to lead deeper into the woods. Curiosity got the better of us, so we followed it. The trail led us to a small clearing with an old, dilapidated shed. It was overgrown with vines and looked as though it hadn't been touched in years. The shed's door hung loosely on its hinges, creaking softly as we approached. "Should we check it out?" Jake asked, his flashlight flickering over the shed. "Why not?" I replied, trying to sound braver than I felt. We pushed the door open, and it groaned in protest. Inside, the shed was filled with old tools, rusted and coated in layers of dust. The air was musty, and a cold draft seemed to seep through the walls. As we explored, I noticed something odd: a mirror propped up against the far wall. It was dusty, but the glass was surprisingly clear. I walked over to the mirror, wiping off the dust with my sleeve. My reflection stared back at me, but there was something unsettling about it. The forest behind me, visible through the mirror, seemed different, darker, more distorted. "Guys, come look at this," I called out. They gathered around, peering at the mirror. Jake joked about it being a magic mirror and pretended to make spooky faces. We all laughed, but there was an edge of nervousness in the air. Just then, we heard a loud bang from outside. We jumped, our flashlights swinging wildly. It sounded like something had crashed through the underbrush. "What was that?" Emily asked, her voice tight with fear. "I don't know," I said, my heart racing. "Maybe an animal." We decided to leave the shed and head back to the cabin. As we turned to leave, I glanced back at the mirror. In that brief moment, I could have sworn I saw something moving behind me in the reflection, a dark, shadowy shape. We hurried back to the cabin, the tension palpable. The night seemed to stretch endlessly, and every little sound made us jump. We locked the doors and windows and tried to calm our nerves, but sleep was elusive. The next morning, we were all on edge. We debated whether to return to the shed, but the idea made us uneasy. Instead, we spent the day by the lake, trying to distract ourselves. The day passed without incident, but the eerie feeling lingered. That evening, as we were preparing dinner, I noticed something unsettling. The mirror from the shed was now hanging in the cabin's living room, above the fireplace. None of us had brought it inside, and it definitely hadn't been there before. "You put this here?" I asked, my voice trembling. Everyone looked at each other, confused and uneasy. We all denied having moved the mirror. The mirror's presence was inexplicable and unsettling. We spent the rest of the evening trying to ignore the mirror, but it was impossible to forget the shadowy shape I had seen in its reflection. That night, we all slept fitfully, each of us disturbed by the lingering sense of unease. The next morning, we packed up and left the cabin early. The forest seemed to watch us as we drove away, and the mirror was left behind, hanging in that old cabin. To this day, I don't know how the mirror ended up in the cabin or what I saw in its reflection. The memory of that weekend and the strange occurrences still gives me chills. We all survived, but the experience left us with an unsettling feeling that some mysteries are better left unexplored. It was late summer when my friends and I decided to spend the night in an old, abandoned cabin deep in the woods. The cabin had a reputation among locals for being haunted, but we were all thrill seekers who enjoyed debunking myths. The plan was simple: spend the night, experience whatever ghostly phenomenon might occur, and leave with a great story. We arrived at the cabin just before sunset. The place was as creepy as we had imagined, dilapidated and overgrown with vines, its windows boarded up and its paint peeling. We set up camp in the main room, where we could keep an eye on the single, rusty door. As night fell, the atmosphere grew thicker. The sounds of the forest were replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin settling. We lit a few candles and started telling ghost stories, trying to get into the spirit of the night. Laughter and nervous jokes filled the air, but there was an underlying tension. Around midnight, I decided to check out the basement. The trapdoor was hidden under an old rug in the corner of the cabin. My friends hesitated but didn't stop me. I pried the door open, revealing a steep, dark staircase leading down into the unknown. With a flashlight in hand, I descended slowly, each step echoing through the gloom. The basement was musty and cluttered with old furniture and broken boxes. As I scanned the room with my flashlight, I noticed something strange: an old rocking chair in the corner, its seat covered in dust. It seemed out of place, as if it had been recently disturbed. I approached it, and as I did, the chair began to rock slowly, back and forth. My heart pounded in my chest, but I tried to stay calm. I took a few pictures with my phone, hoping to capture whatever was causing the movement. Just then, I heard a faint whispering sound, like voices carried on the wind. The sound was almost imperceptible, but it grew louder as I moved closer to the rocking chair. I froze, listening intently. The whispering grew into distinct words, though I couldn't make out what was being said. I turned to leave, but the basement door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. Panic set in. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. My flashlight dimmed further, and the whispering grew louder, more urgent. I banged on the door, shouting for my friends. My voice echoed in the confined space, but there was no response. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The room fell into an oppressive silence. I slumped against the wall, trying to catch my breath. My flashlight finally flickered back to life, casting a weak beam around the basement. I noticed a strange, handwritten note pinned to the wall near the rocking chair. It read, "They never leave." My hands trembled as I took a picture of it. The message added to the growing sense of dread. After what felt like an eternity, the basement door creaked open. I stumbled up the stairs, my heart still racing. I burst into the main room, where my friends were waiting anxiously. "What happened down there?" Jake asked, his face pale. The door slammed shut, And I heard voices, I said, trying to steady my voice. There was a note on the wall. We decided to leave immediately, our curiosity now overshadowed by fear. We packed up quickly and exited the cabin, casting one last glance at the eerie structure. The forest seemed to close in around us as we drove away, the cabin disappearing into the darkness behind us. The experience left us all shaken. We later learned that the cabin had a tragic history. Its last resident had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a room filled with unsettling artifacts and strange notes. We couldn't explain the rocking chair or the whispering, but the story was enough to make us never want to return. The cabin remains a ghostly legend in our minds, a reminder that some places hold onto their secrets in ways that defy explanation. Despite our encounter, we all made it out safely, but the memories of that night linger as a chilling reminder of the unknown lurking just beyond the edge of reality. It was a chilly evening when my friends and I decided to explore an old, abandoned house on the edge of town. The house had been vacant for decades, and though it had always been the subject of local ghost stories, none of us truly believed in the supernatural. We were just looking for a bit of adventure, a break from our usual routine. The house was a ramshackle Victorian, its paint peeling and windows darkened by years of neglect. We approached cautiously, our flashlights cutting through the creeping fog that had settled in. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. We forced the front door open, which crowed loudly as if protesting our intrusion. Inside, the air was still and heavy, filled with the musty scent of disuse. Dust motes floated in the beams of our flashlights, creating an otherworldly glow. The first floor was largely empty except for a few old furniture pieces draped in sheets. We laughed nervously, our voices echoing in the silence. As we moved to explore the second floor, we noticed a door slightly ajar, leading to what looked like an attic space. It was a narrow, steep staircase that spiraled upwards. "Let's check it out," Jake suggested, ever the brave one. Reluctantly, we climbed the stairs, each step creaking ominously. The attic was cluttered with old trunks and forgotten belongings, but it was an old mirror against the wall that caught my eye. It was large and ornate, covered in a thick layer of dust. "I bet this mirror is older than the house," Emily said, brushing off some of the grime as she cleaned a small spot. The mirror's surface reflected our faces, and we could see the room behind us clearly. But then something strange happened. I noticed a shadow moving in the reflection, not matching any of our movements. I turned around, but the attic was empty, save for us. "Did anyone else see that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "No, what are you talking about?" Jake replied, frowning. I hesitated, unsure if I had imagined it. The shadow seemed almost like a dark figure, but it was indistinct. We continued to examine the attic, but the uneasy feeling lingered. The mirror's reflection seemed to warp slightly as if something were distorting it from the other side. Then came a loud bang from below, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Our flashlights flickered, and the air seemed to grow colder. We froze, exchanging worried glances. "Maybe it's just the house settling," Sarah suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. We carefully made our way back down to the main floor, trying to ignore the increasing sense of dread. The footsteps continued, echoing through the empty rooms. Each sound seemed to come from different directions, making it impossible to pinpoint. When we reached the ground floor, the noises abruptly stopped. We searched the house thoroughly, but there was no one else there. The silence was almost more unnerving than the noises had been. We decided it was time to leave. As we exited the house, I glanced back at the attic window. The mirror was clearly visible from the outside, but it looked different, somehow more like a dark void than a reflective surface. We gathered outside, our nerves on edge. The fog had thickened, wrapping the house in an impenetrable shroud. We talked nervously about what we had experienced, but no one had a clear explanation. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadowy figure in the mirror replayed in my mind, and I wondered if we had unwittingly disturbed something that was best left alone. We never went back to the house, and over time, it fell into even greater disrepair. The stories about it grew with each passing year, becoming more chilling with each retelling. To this day, I'm not sure what we saw or heard that night, but the experience left a lasting impression on me. The mirror, the footsteps, and the shadow remain a mystery. It's a reminder that some places carry an air of the unknown, and sometimes, it's better not to press too deeply into those shadows. I've never been one for ghost stories or supernatural theories, but what happened to me a few years ago changed my perspective forever. It started on a seemingly ordinary night. My friends and I had decided to spend the weekend at an old cabin in the mountains. The cabin belonged to a family friend who hadn't visited in years, so it was the perfect escape from the hustle of city life. The drive up was picturesque, with autumn leaves painting the landscape in shades of orange and red. We arrived just before dusk, and the cabin was exactly as described, charming but a little run-down, perched on a hill overlooking a serene lake. The place had an almost timeless quality to it, and we were all eager to settle in. That first evening was peaceful. We unpacked, lit a fire in the fireplace, and shared stories while cooking dinner. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped, and the cabin took on an even cozier feel. We went to bed early, hoping to make the most of the following day's hiking. I was the first one awake the next morning. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the cabin. I decided to make coffee and enjoy the quiet while everyone else slept. As I walked around, I noticed a strange thing. The cabin had an attic, which was unusual for such a small place. The door to the attic was old and wooden, with a rusty padlock on it. Curiosity got the better of me, and I managed to pry the padlock open with a crowbar I found in the shed. The attic was a small, dusty space filled with old trunks and furniture draped in sheets. It looked like a scene straight out of a horror movie, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary until I noticed a large, ornate mirror leaning against the wall. It was a beautiful piece, with an elaborate frame that seemed oddly out of place in the dusty attic. I was about to turn away when I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror. It looked like a shadow, a vague, shifting form just behind me. I spun around, but the attic was empty. I shrugged it off as a trick of the light and went back downstairs. The day passed without incident. We hiked, laughed, and enjoyed our time together. As night fell, we gathered around the fire and exchanged more stories, our earlier excitement overshadowing any lingering unease. That night, things took a turn. Around midnight, I woke up to a faint sound like someone was moving around in the attic. I ignored it at first, thinking it was just the house settling. But the noise grew louder, almost like footsteps, and the creaking of floorboards directly above my room was impossible to ignore. I decided to investigate, hoping to prove to myself that there was nothing to be afraid of. I grabbed a flashlight and headed upstairs. The attic door was still slightly ajar, and the noise seemed to be coming from within. I hesitated for a moment but pushed the door open and shone my flashlight around. The mirror was still there, its surface reflecting the cluttered attic. I approached it, and that's when I saw it again, a dark, shadowy form in the mirror, moving slowly across the room. My heart pounded in my chest. I turned around quickly, but the attic was empty. The only sound the soft hum of the wind outside. I went back downstairs, my mind racing with possibilities. I didn't want to alarm my friends, so I tried to brush off the experience and went back to bed. The next morning, I didn't mention anything to them, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. We left the cabin later that day, our adventure cut short by a strange sense of unease. As we drove away, I took one last look at the cabin, its silhouette standing starkly against the mountain backdrop. I saw nothing unusual, but the experience left me with an unsettling feeling. I did a little research after returning home and found out that the cabin had a history. A previous owner had vanished mysteriously, and there were local rumors of strange occurrences. The mirror was a relic from that time, and many believed it to be cursed. To this day, I can't fully explain what I saw in that attic. The shadowy figure in the mirror remains a mystery. I still think about that night often, wondering if the cabin holds secrets that are better left undiscovered. Despite the eerie experience, I'm grateful that nothing worse happened, but the memory of that shadowy presence lingers in my mind, a chilling reminder that some places have a way of hiding things we might be better off not knowing. The old mansion on the outskirts of town had always fascinated me. It was a grand, decaying structure with a long history of abandonment and eerie tales. When a few friends and I decided to explore it, we were eager for a thrill, though none of us expected what we would encounter that night. We arrived at twilight, the sun setting behind the mansion and casting long, menacing shadows. The house looked exactly as it did in the stories, tall, dark, and foreboding. The windows were broken, and the front porch sagged ominously. Despite our nervousness, we were excited and ready for the adventure. With flashlights in hand, we approached the front door. To our surprise, it was slightly ajar. We exchanged glances but decided to press on. The creaking door opened with an unsettling groan, revealing a dusty floor cluttered with old furniture and cobwebs. We took cautious steps inside, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The interior was as neglected as we had imagined. Old, tattered drapes, furniture covered in sheets, and the musty smell of mildew. We explored the first floor, moving through the rooms, but nothing seemed particularly unusual. We joked and laughed, trying to ease the growing tension. It wasn't until we reached the staircase that things took a turn. The stairs led down to what appeared to be a basement. The door to the basement was closed but not locked. We hesitated, but our curiosity got the better of us. We slowly opened the door and descended the creaky steps into the pitch-black basement. The air down there was cooler and heavier. Our flashlights revealed stacks of old boxes, broken furniture, and a cluttered assortment of forgotten items. As we moved deeper, we noticed a peculiar sight: an old, ornate mirror standing against the wall, partially covered in dust. "Hey, check this out," Jake called, his voice echoing in the basement. We gathered around the mirror. The frame was elaborate, almost regal, and the glass, though dusty, seemed to hold a strange allure. I wiped the spot clean and glanced at the reflection. For a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the corner of the room behind us, a shadowy figure that seemed out of place. Did anyone else see that? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "See what?" Emily replied, peering at the mirror. "Nothing," I said, shaking off the unease. "Let's keep looking." We continued to explore, but the sense of unease grew stronger. The mirror seemed to draw our attention back, and every time I looked, the shadow seemed to be moving closer. It was as if the mirror itself was watching us. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the basement, making us all jump. It came from the direction of the furnace, which was old and rusted. We approached it cautiously, and when we shone our flashlights on it, we saw nothing out of the ordinary, but the noise hadn't settled us. We decided to leave the basement and return to the main floor. As we climbed the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The atmosphere in the house felt thicker, more oppressive. Back in the foyer, we heard a faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from upstairs. It was intermittent, almost like footsteps moving in a pattern. Our nerves were on edge, but we decided to investigate, hoping to find a logical explanation. We made our way up the stairs, each step creaking loudly in the silence. The tapping grew louder, leading us to an old bedroom at the end of the hallway. We slowly pushed open the door and looked inside. The room was empty, except for an old rocking chair in the corner that was gently swaying back and forth, despite there being no draft. "Okay, this is officially creepy," Sarah said, her voice trembling. We watched the chair for a moment, the rhythmic rocking seeming almost deliberate. The tapping sound stopped abruptly, leaving us in an uncomfortable silence. We decided it was best to leave, the eerie atmosphere too much for our nerves. As we exited the mansion, the oppressive feeling lifted. Outside, the night air felt refreshing, and we laughed nervously, trying to shake off the fear. Though we all made it out safely, the experience left a lasting impression. We never found an explanation for the shadowy figure in the mirror or the mysterious noises. The mansion remained a haunting memory, a reminder of how sometimes curiosity can lead you into the unknown and unexplained. Last year, I had the unnerving experience of visiting an old, abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of our town. It was a place we'd heard about from local legends, rumored to be haunted and steeped in unsettling stories. Curious and skeptical, my friends and I decided to check it out one evening. Just as the sun was setting, the house was isolated, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to close in on it. As we drove up the long, gravel driveway, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the field. We parked at the edge of the driveway, our headlights illuminating the dilapidated structure. The old farmhouse stood as a grim relic of the past, with broken windows and a sagging roof. We approached the front door, which hung slightly ajar. A cold draft seeped out, carrying with it the musty scent of decay. We hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances, but our curiosity won out. With a collective deep breath, we stepped inside. The foyer was dark and silent, the air thick with dust. Our flashlights cut through the gloom, revealing cobwebs in every corner and old furniture draped in white sheets. The entire place felt frozen in time, as though it was waiting for someone to return. As we moved through the rooms, each one seemed more unsettling than the last. The living room had an old piano, its keys cracked and covered in dust. In the dining room, an ancient table was set with rusted silverware, as though it had been prepared for a meal decades ago. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was when we reached the basement door that things took a turn. The door was half open, and a musty, damp smell wafted up the stairs. We exchanged nervous glances but decided to explore. The basement stairs creaked ominously under our weight, and as we descended, the temperature dropped noticeably. The basement was cluttered with old, forgotten items, broken furniture, dusty crates, and an old, flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes, was an old mirror. Its frame was ornate but tarnished, and the glass was covered in grime. "Check this out," I said, my voice echoing in the stillness. We gathered around the mirror, and I wiped away some of the dust. What I saw made my blood run cold. The mirror's reflection showed not only us but something else, an indistinct shadowy figure standing just behind us. The figure was faint, barely discernible, but it was there. "Guys, look at this," I said, my voice trembling. "What are you talking about?" Jake asked, peering into the mirror. Before anyone could respond, a loud bang echoed from upstairs, followed by what sounded like footsteps. We all jumped, our flashlights swinging toward the basement stairs. "Did someone else come in?" Emily whispered, her face pale. "I don't think so," I said. We were the only ones here. We decided to investigate the noise, though I felt a growing sense of dread. As we reached the ground floor, the footsteps stopped. The house was eerily silent, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to close in around us. We moved cautiously through the rooms, but there was no sign of anyone else. The house felt unnervingly empty, and the feeling of being watched was palpable. "We should leave," Sarah said, her voice quivering. We quickly made our way back to the front door. As we stepped outside, the cool night air was a welcome relief. We glanced back at the house, its dark windows staring back at us like empty eyes. The drive home was quiet, each of us lost in our thoughts. The shadowy figure in the mirror and the mysterious footsteps remained unexplained. We talked about it briefly, trying to rationalize what we had seen and heard, but nothing seemed to make sense. The next day, I returned to the house alone, driven by a mix of curiosity and lingering unease. The mirror was still there, but nothing had changed. The shadowy figure was gone, and the house was just as abandoned as before. As I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house held secrets that were better left undisturbed. The experience left a lasting impression on me, a reminder that some places carry an unsettling weight, and sometimes it's better to leave them alone. I was on a road trip with my friends, and we were taking a detour through some remote countryside. We had heard about an old, abandoned farmhouse that was rumored to be haunted. Naturally, we were intrigued and decided to check it out. None of us were particularly superstitious, but we figured it would be a memorable adventure. The farmhouse was located at the end of a long, winding dirt road, flanked by dense woods on either side. As we approached, the sky darkened, and a fog began to roll in, shrouding the landscape in an eerie mist. The house itself was a dilapidated relic, its once grand structure now marred by time and neglect. Despite its forlorn appearance, we were excited to explore. We parked the car and made our way up the creaky steps to the front door. To our surprise, it swung open with little resistance. Inside, the air was musty, filled with the scent of mold and decay. We turned on our flashlights and began to explore. The interior was as expected: dusty furniture covered with sheets, old photographs hanging crookedly on the walls. Everything was fairly ordinary until we stumbled upon the basement door. It was slightly ajar, and a cold draft seeped through the gap. We debated whether to investigate but decided to go down anyway. The basement was cluttered with old boxes, broken furniture, and forgotten relics. In one corner, partially hidden under a pile of old blankets, was a large, ornate mirror. The glass was covered in grime, making it difficult to see clearly. Curious, I wiped the spot clean with my sleeve. The reflection was hazy at first, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw something unsettling. Behind us, in the reflection, there was a shadowy figure standing still. It was indistinct, like a smudge, but it was unmistakably there. "Guys, look at this!" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. My friends gathered around, their faces illuminated by the flashlight beams. They all saw this dark, formless shape in the mirror. We were all a bit on edge, but Jake, ever the skeptic, tried to rationalize it. "It's probably just a trick of the light or dust." Despite his explanation, the uneasy feeling remained. We decided to leave the basement and investigate the rest of the house, but as we started to head upstairs, we heard a loud bang from the basement. It sounded like something heavy had fallen. Our nerves were on edge, but we braved it and went back down. The mirror was still there, but the shadowy figure was gone. We checked the basement thoroughly, but there was nothing that could explain the noise. The atmosphere felt heavier now, more oppressive. We decided it was best to leave, so we quickly made our way to the front door. As we were about to step outside, the house seemed to come alive with strange noises, creaking floors, distant whispers, and the unsettling sound of footsteps echoing through empty rooms. With a mix of fear and relief, we left the house and returned to our car. The fog outside had thickened, and the moonlight barely penetrated the mist. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was following us. The shadowy figure in the mirror had left a lingering sense of dread that none of us could ignore. We talked about the experience as we drove, trying to make sense of what we had seen. The house remained shrouded in fog and mystery, a place that seemed to hold onto its secrets tightly. Although we made it out safely, the eerie feeling stayed with us long after we had left. Back home, we researched the farmhouse and discovered that it had a history of strange occurrences and inexplicable phenomena. People who had ventured inside reported similar experiences with shadowy figures and unsettling noises. It was clear that we weren't the only ones who had felt the house's oppressive presence. Even now, when I think back on that night, I feel a chill. The farmhouse remains a place of intrigue and fear, a reminder that some places hold on to something beyond our understanding, and some experiences are best left unexplored.